The night the fog swallowed North Point Lighthouse, Mason Hale heard metal breathing behind stone. His dog, Echo, froze ears pricked, muscles taut, then pawed at the bulkhead like she'd found a heartbeat inside the wall. A hollow clang answered her touch. When Mason leaned in, cold air whispered through a seam that shouldn't exist. The storm outside roared, but the real danger waited within something hidden, humming, alive. By dawn, officials would call it an inspection. Mason knew better, because whatever had been sealed in this lighthouse decades ago wasn't done keeping its secrets. An echo had just woken it up. The morning came late to North Point. Even after the sun had technically risen, the fog refused to lift, clinging to the cliffs in sheets of pale glass. From the gallery, Mason Hale could just make out the horizon by its motion, the slow drag of the tide pulling color through gray. He rested his mug on the railing and rubbed the stiffness from his knee. Somewhere in the mist, Echo moved like a darker shade of fog ears pricked, tail steady, her body angling toward the sea. Not much to guard out there, Mason said. Echo gave a short huff, the kind that said, "You don't know what I hear." That was the thing about the dog. She never barked without reason. And last night she'd barked at stone. North Point wasn't much of a lighthouse anymore. The Coast Guard had automated the light years ago. They'd stripped its budget, closed the keeper's station, left the place to rust and weather itself into memory. Mason had inherited it the way some men inherited debts, a gesture written in an old friend's will and ignored by everyone else. Captain Alcott's letter had said only, "Keep her breathing. When the sea goes silent, she'll tell you why." Mason hadn't known what that meant, but the alternative, selling the property, moving inland, had felt like betrayal, so he'd stayed. He repaired what he could with the money from odd carpentry jobs. He'd built a rough shelf for books, replaced the cracked window panes with storm glass, and learned the rhythm of the wind that scraped through the tower's vents. The walls always sounded alive, creaking, sighing, but last night's hollow knock had been different. Echo's reaction proved it. Now she stood near the bulkhead again, staring at the iron seam as if waiting for it to exhale. Mason finished his coffee, poured the dregs over the railing, and said, "You'll drive me crazy, you know that?" Echo thumped her tail once against the floorboards but didn't look away. The lighthouse demanded constant attention, paint, grease, patch, repeat. Work kept Mason steady. If his hands were busy, his head stayed quiet. By mid-morning, he'd cleared the rusted gears from the winch and tested the backup generator. Echo followed him up and down the narrow spiral like a shadow stitched to his heels. He'd been alone here almost 8 months. At first, the isolation had been a kind of medicine, quiet enough to drown the echoes of places that still lived in his bones. He'd left a different desert behind, one made of heat and dust instead of salt and wind. Sometimes, when the foghorn moaned, he heard another sound beneath it. A radio squelch, a voice calling coordinates he'd rather forget. He pushed the thought aside, wiped grease from his palms, and checked his watch. Supplies were running low. He needed fuel, canned goods, paint, and coffee, always coffee. The truck coughed to life, spitting sand from its tires as it climbed the switchback toward town. Echo sat in the passenger seat, her head tilted just high enough to keep her nose near the cracked window. "Guess we're socializing today," Mason said. "Don't glare at anyone." She didn't promise anything. The road wound through dune grass and skeletons of old wharves. 20 minutes later, they rolled past the rusted "Welcome to Port Crescent" sign paint peeling, one corner missing from a bullet years ago. The town had once thrived on fishing and boat repair. Now its biggest industry was gossip. The hardware store was a 2-room building with dusty shelves and the smell of motor oil. Mason loaded sandpaper, paint thinner, and a spool of wiring onto the counter. He was sliding cash across when the clerk's eyes shifted toward the door. "Got company," the man muttered. Mason turned. She was impossible to miss, a tall woman in a charcoal coat, posture straight as a blade, heels clicking against the floorboards. Her hair was the color of iron under frost, her smile practiced to the millimeter. "Mr. Hale?" He nodded once. "Depends who's asking." "Virginia Parrish." She offered a card. "Harbor Renewal Trust." The same name printed on the new roadside sign. "I'm heading the North Point redevelopment project. You have quite the landmark out there." "Had," he said. "Now it's just a roof with a light." Her smile didn't waver. "A light that sits on a parcel we're looking to repurpose. The county's eager to see progress." "Progress?" "Clean energy," she said smoothly. "Windport, maintenance hub, hundreds of jobs." Mason kept his eyes on the counter. "And my home sits in the middle. We could make that worth your while." "How worth?" She slid a folder toward him. 30% above appraised value plus relocation assistance. All it takes is a signature. He tapped the edge of the folder but didn't open it. And if I say no? Her voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. Then the county may review the lighthouse's safety certification. If it fails inspection, they'll condemn it. Mason exhaled through his nose, slow. So that's the pitch, buy or bury. I prefer win-win. Funny, he said. Sounds like checkmate. For a heartbeat, their gazes held his steady, hers calculating. Then she smiled again, too bright. Think about it, Mr. Hale. The inspection is scheduled for tomorrow morning. She turned and left, perfume mixing with the smell of oil and salt. Echo watched her go, tail twitching. Don't start, Mason murmured. I know. They drove home under a pale sun that looked more like a scar than light. Mason didn't speak. Echo leaned against his arm, steadying him whenever the truck hit a rut. The silence between them was the same silence that had once filled the airstrip before a mission, expectant, heavy. By the time they reached the lighthouse, the tide had crawled high. Waves licked at the stone base like hands testing a door. Mason parked, unloaded the supplies, and paused to watch the surf for a moment. He thought of Parrish's voice, calm, patient, the way officers used to sound before sending someone where the map ended. He'd heard it before, in a different form. He shook it off, set the paint cans by the door, and started climbing the stairs. Echo went ahead, nails clinking against metal. Halfway up, the smell hit him. Ozone, faint and metallic. He stopped. You smell that? Echo's nose went high. Her body stiffened. She whined once, low. Mason reached the generator room. The door was ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, the relay panel hung open, wires exposed. Fresh tape looped around the circuit labeled lens power. On the tape, barely visible in the low light, were printed words, Property of Harbor Renewal Trust. Mason peeled it off slowly. The adhesive left a clean stripe through years of dust. Guess the welcome committee came early, he muttered. Echo growled softly, her hackles raised. He pocketed the tape. Come on, let's make sure they didn't take souvenirs. By dusk, the fog returned rolling in over the cliffs like smoke. Mason sat at the narrow table beneath the spiral stairs. The tape stretched flat beside the old caretaker's ledger. The ledger's pages smelled of oil and mildew. Captain Alcott had kept it religiously entries in tidy, cursive, every page dated. Mason flipped to the last written line. Beacon tested. Echo good. Him 245 tonight. He frowned. Him 245. He'd seen those numbers scattered through earlier entries, always paired with tide levels. He traced them with his thumb. Echo padded over, nose brushing the page. Her tail moved once, uncertainly. He smiled faintly. You think it's code too? The dog looked up, eyes bright in the lamplight. Could be old radio logs, he murmured. Or maybe the man really liked church. Either way, Alcott had been deliberate. The old keeper never wasted ink. Mason closed the book, letting the thought settle in the back of his mind. Patterns always began small, a word here, a number there. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap the glass. He climbed to the lantern room to check the seals. The world below had vanished under fog. Only the sound of waves proved it still existed. He spoke quietly, half to himself. You'd laugh at this, Cap, me chasing ghosts in your notebook. His reflection looked back from the dark lens, older, harder, but still carrying the same eyes that once stared across desert heat, waiting for orders that came too late. Echo circled once and lay near his feet. He said, You trust your instincts too much. You end up wrong once, and it sticks forever. The dog lifted her head, as if disagreeing. Yeah, he admitted. Maybe twice. Thunder rumbled offshore. The storm was closing in. He switched the lens to manual, the beam cutting through fog like a knife. Each sweep caught silver on the waves, then vanished into gray. The sound calmed him, the motor hum, the faint creak of metal, the pulse of the light. It was a rhythm he could match his breathing to. Down below, Echo barked once. He leaned over the railing. What is it now? She stood at the base of the stairs, rigid, staring toward the maintenance door. Mason hurried down, flashlight cutting through the dark. The beam found footprints fresh, deep, pointing out of the tower this time. Whoever had been here was gone. The padlock on the outer door hung open. He knelt, fingers brushing the wet metal. Rainwater mixed with something slicker oil. Someone's been inside again, he muttered. Echo sniffed the lock, then looked toward the sea, ears pinned flat. Mason followed her gaze. Out beyond the rocks, A single light moved across the water, too low for a ship, too steady for a buoy. A small boat. No running lights. He watched until the fog swallowed it. Back inside, he bolted the doors and killed the generator to save fuel. Candlelight threw long shadows on the stone. The lighthouse creaked as wind rose outside. He sat on the bunk, rubbing the scar that climbed his forearm. They want the land? They can file papers. Why sneak in? Echo rested her chin on his boot, eyes half closed but ears alert. Yeah, he said softly. Doesn't feel like a real estate problem, does it? Rain hammered the glass. Mason opened Alcott's ledger again, turning to the back cover. Faint impressions from heavy writing had indented the leather. He held it to the candle. Under the light, a line of numbers emerged like ghosts. 3894 divided by NPT. Coordinates? A code? He stared until the numbers blurred, then closed the book. Tomorrow, he whispered, we open that wall. Echo's tail thumped once. He reached down, scratched behind her ear. You and me, girl. One more tour. Outside, the wind shifted from moan to howl. Somewhere deep in the tower, metal answered metal again, 3 dull clangs, spaced like words. Echo rose, hackles up. Mason looked toward the bulkhead, the one she'd barked at last night. All right, he breathed. You win. He grabbed the wrench, lantern, and rope. The storm could wait. The truth wouldn't. The storm rolled in just before dawn, hammering the cliffs with sheets of salt water and wind that made the tower sway in its foundations. Mason had barely slept. He'd sat upright most of the night with his back to the wall and the wrench still in his hand, waiting for the sound to return. By the time light bled through the fog, he'd already made his decision. If the county's safety inspection was coming in a few hours, he needed to see what was behind that bulkhead first, before someone else did. Echo circled restlessly near the door, nails clicking against stone. When she saw Mason pull on his tool belt, her tail lifted, cautious but eager. Yeah, he said quietly, we're doing this. The bulkhead stood halfway up the spiral, disguised as part of the outer wall riveted steel framed by stone. Rust streaked down its face like dried blood. Mason ran his hand along the seam. Cold air leaked from somewhere behind it, carrying the faint scent of oil and old dust. Echo whined low in her throat, nose pressed to the corner. Back up, girl. He wedged the lantern onto a crate, drove the wrench against the first bolt. The metal shrieked in protest, echoing through the tower like a warning. Outside, the wind answered. By the third bolt, his hands were slick with rain and sweat. Echo paced behind him, tail stiff, body trembling with alert focus. The last bolt clattered to the floor. Mason hooked his fingers into the edge and pulled. The steel groaned, giving only an inch. He braced his boot against the wall and heaved again. The seam split with a sucking gasp of air, cold, stale, metallic. A rush of scent hit him, salt, machine oil, and something faintly electric, like old batteries. The panel swung wide enough for the lantern light to slip through. Behind it was a narrow corridor no longer than 10 feet, carved into the stone. The walls were lined with conduits, bundles of wire, and a table bolted to the floor. On it sat an obsolete radio transceiver, olive drab paint peeling, knobs worn smooth by use. He stepped inside slowly, brushing dust from a brass plate stamped U.S. Coast Communications, 1962. Echo followed, tail lowered, but nose high, sniffing the air with short, sharp breaths. This shouldn't exist, Mason murmured. The Coast Guard had decommissioned all analog posts decades ago, so why was one sealed inside his wall? He crouched beside the table. A clipboard lay half buried under debris, pages yellowed, corners curled. The top sheet bore a signature he recognized instantly, J. Alcott, his mentor. The log entries were brief, cryptic: Mar-Nov, transmission stable, cargo confirmed. Mar-10. Directive received lockdown. Mar-11. Asset sealed under tower per order. Beneath the final line, scrawled in darker ink, trust the sea to hide what men cannot. Mason stared until the letters blurred. The handwriting was undeniably Alcott's firm, clean strokes. What did you do, Cap? He whispered. Echo nudged his arm, guiding his attention toward the floor. Half hidden under coiled cables sat a metal case, its edges rounded, the lock corroded but intact. Mason dragged it into the light. It weighed more than it should have, dense, uneven. The top bore a faded stenciled label, property of Juniper Basin Trust. His pulse quickened. He'd seen that phrase before. Parrish's business card had carried the same logo and faint watermark. He set the case on the table and tried the latch. Locked solid. Echo whined again, pawing at the edge. "I know," Mason said. "We're not forcing it." "Not yet." He took a step back, forcing his breath slow. If Alcott had sealed this room, he'd done it for a reason. Maybe to protect something, maybe to bury it. Either way, it had just become Mason's problem. A car door slammed outside. Mason flinched, then checked his watch. 9:06 a.m. Right on schedule. Echo, stay. He closed the bulkhead enough to hide the opening, though not yet bolted. Lantern light spilled in a thin line across the floor. Boots climbed the steps, 2 sets, steady, professional. Then came a knock at the outer door. He opened it to find a man in an orange safety vest holding a clipboard, rain dripping from his hard hat. Beside him stood Virginia Parrish, immaculate as ever despite the weather. "Morning, Mr. Hale," she said brightly. "Inspection time." Mason leaned against the door frame. "Didn't think executives did field work." "I believe in oversight," she replied. "This structure's part of an active safety concern." The inspector glanced around the room. "Power status?" "Stable." "Generator?" "Offline until you're done here." He scribbled something, then moved toward the stairs. Parrish's eyes lingered on the unlatched bulkhead. "You've been busy." "Storm prep," Mason said. She smiled, but the look never reached her eyes. "I hope so. The last keeper wasn't very forthcoming either." He froze. "You knew Alcott?" "Only by record." Her tone turned airy. A shame how isolation can distort good judgment. Before he could answer, the inspector called from above. "We've got a tagged circuit open here, ma'am." Mason's goot tightened. They'd find the altered relay, the one with harbor renewal tape. He took a step toward the stairs, but Parrish blocked him lightly with an outstretched arm. "No need, Mr. Hale. We'll handle it." Her nails were immaculate, pale against the steel railing. "You planted it," he said quietly. Her smile returned, slow and precise. "Proof of negligence is still proof. Get out." "Careful," she said. Anger reads badly in reports. The exchange drew the inspector's attention. He descended halfway, raincoat dripping. "We're citing a safety violation on the lens power relay. Temporary padlock order until review." "Padlock?" Mason repeated. "You can't—" "It's protocol," Parrish interrupted. "You'll have your hearing next week. Meanwhile, relocation assistance stands. I'd suggest taking it." The inspector extended the form. "Sign here acknowledging notice." Mason didn't take it. "You think this place belongs to you?" Parrish's tone softened. "I think it belongs to Progress." He stepped closer. "Progress doesn't sneak around with bolt cutters." For the first time, her mask slipped, just slightly. "You should be careful what you accuse people of, Mr. Hale, especially when your own record isn't spotless." The words hit harder than any insult. She'd read his file. He said nothing. She turned to leave, coat snapping in the wind. "We'll be in touch after the storm." When the door closed behind them, Mason stood motionless. Only Echo's low growl reminded him to breathe. He waited until the sound of the engine faded, then bolted the door and reopened the bulkhead. The corridor smelled sharper now, like ozone charged by anger itself. The lantern flickered. He crouched beside the safe again, fingertips brushing the stenciled letters. "Juniper Basin Trust," he murmured. "Same company, same game." Echo barked once short, decisive. "Yeah," he said. "Time to open it." He searched Alcott's radio logs again. At the bottom of one page, a numeric sequence matched the indentation he'd found the night before. 3894 divided by NPT. He tried the combination on the safe's dial. The first 3 clicks aligned easily, the last required a firm twist. A metallic pop echoed in the chamber. The lid opened with a sigh. Inside lay a stack of weathered envelopes tied with cord, a brass coin engraved with the same crest as Parrish's folder, and a small cassette labeled Sealed Asset divided by 1973. Mason lifted it carefully. The tape rattled inside, brittle from age. "What did you hide, Cap?" he whispered. At the bottom of the safe, wrapped in waxed canvas, rested a slim notebook. Its cover was stamped with a government seal. He opened to the first page. Confidential record, Red Valley Development, divided by subsidiary Juniper Basin Trust. Custodian of record, Captain Jonathan Alcott, North Point Station. Beneath it, in Alcott's handwriting, "If this passes to my successor, protect the evidence until the law is ready to listen. They will come for it first. Mason exhaled through his teeth. The numbers in the ledger, the hymn references, the sealed room, it all connected. Alcott hadn't been a hermit. He'd been a keeper in the truest sense. And now, Mason was the only one who knew. Echo barked again, sharp. He looked up, startled. The outer door rattled once, then again, harder. Wind couldn't move steel that way. Someone was still out there. He shut the safe, doused the lantern, and pulled the bulkhead closed, just as a silhouette crossed the frosted window above the stairs. Echo pressed against his leg, silent but ready. A muffled voice came through the door, male, unfamiliar, low. "County maintenance. You left your generator on." Mason didn't answer. The knob turned once, twice. Metal squealed against the latch. Then footsteps receded down the stairs, fading into the howl of wind. Mason waited a full minute before breathing out. He looked at Echo. Her eyes glowed gold in the half-dark. "All right," he said. "Now we know what they're really after." He glanced toward the bulkhead, its seam once more hidden behind shadow, and tightened his grip on the wrench. "Whatever this is, Cap," he murmured, "you left me holding it." Outside, the storm hit the tower full on, waves slamming like fists against the rock. Inside, the secret pulsed quietly behind steel and stone, alive again after decades of silence. And through it all, Echo never took her eyes off the door. The storm raged for 3 days. The county's power lines failed before noon, leaving the lighthouse wrapped in electric silence. Mason rationed fuel, cooking by lantern light, and feeding Echo canned beans and water warmed on the stove. Every few hours, he checked the bulkhead to be sure the hidden chamber stayed dry. The cassette tape sat on the table, untouched, beside Alcott's ledger and the brass coin. He hadn't played it yet, not without knowing who might still be listening. By the 4th night, he'd had enough of waiting. He wound the crank generator and plugged in the battered shortwave player he'd salvaged from the supply closet. When the tape clicked into place, the speakers crackled to life. Static, faint music, then a man's voice under the hiss. "Transmission 41. Cargo secured. Confirm seal. Juniper Basin asset active." Mason froze. The voice was Alcott's, unmistakable even through distortion. Another voice replied, distant, official. "Affirmative. Proceed with custodial lock. Maintain radio silence until authorized recovery." Then static. He replayed it twice. Each time the word asset hit harder. "What were you keeping here, Cap?" Echo looked up from the floor, ears twitching. She stood, tail stiff, nose aimed at the ceiling. Then Mason heard it too, a faint vibration through the tower's frame, like a motor idling somewhere deep inside the walls. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed the stairs. The beam flickered off corroded bolts and damp iron until it landed on the relay box beside the lens chamber. Its cover was shut, but the faint hum behind it didn't belong to the generator. "Somebody left something running," he muttered. He pried it open. Inside, a compact transmitter pulsed with a slow green light. "Echo," he whispered. "Find it." The dog circled, nose close to the floor, following the faint ozone scent to the base of the ladder where a bundle of wires disappeared into the wall. She barked once, decisive. Mason knelt and traced the line. The cable was new, clean insulation, modern plastic. It wasn't part of the original 1,960 seconds wiring. Somebody had reactivated Alcott's equipment. He followed the wire down the stairwell to a panel near the main door. The connection ran through a hole freshly drilled through the masonry, leading outside toward the rocks. When he stepped out into the rain, lightning flashed across the bay. For a second he saw it a buoy anchored offshore, tiny and unnatural, its light blinking in a sequence too regular for random waves. Morse code. Short, short, long. Pausa. Repeat. Echo barked once, like she recognized the rhythm. Mason stared into the rain until the code vanished into darkness. Later that night, a faint metallic clank echoed from below. Mason snapped upright, grabbing his flashlight. Echo was already at the door, growling. He descended the spiral staircase silently, boots landing on cold iron. The air smelled of seawater and oil. At the base of the tower, the maintenance hatch stood open. He saw a figure in a slicker bent over the generator panel, gloved hands working quickly. Mason's light hit his back. The man turned, startled, and bolted toward the cliff path. "Hey!" Mason shouted, running after him. The rain made the steps slick. Twice his boot nearly slipped off the narrow iron rail. Echo surged ahead, faster, barking. The stranger reached the edge of the bluff, stumbled, then leapt the railing and vanished down the slope toward the dock. Mason followed, lungs burning. By the time he reached the bottom, the man was already in a small motor skiff. Its engine roared to life, red taillight slicing through the mist. Mason shouted again, voice lost in the storm. Something gleamed in the mud where the man had fallen a badge. Mason stooped to pick it up. It read, Harbor Renewal Trust, authorized contractor. He held it up to the rain until the ink blurred. They're not just watching, he said to Echo. They're operating. By morning, the rain had slowed to mist. Mason knew he couldn't fight a corporation with a wrench and a dog. He needed information, something he could prove. He drove into Port Crescent. Mud caked on his tires, coat still damp. Echo stayed close, never more than a pace behind. The town's library was quiet, the way old libraries always are air-heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of decaying paper. The librarian, Mrs. Renner, blinked at him over half-moon glasses. Back again, mister. Hale? I need records. Church hymnals. Coastal survey maps from the 50s. She frowned. That's an unusual mix. Humorme. An hour later, he had spread books across 2 tables. Alcott's ledger opened beside a hymnal from 1953. He traced the numbers in the margins. 245, 38, 94. They matched hymn titles. Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Abide with Me, Rock of Ages. Each hymn had a verse about water, salvation, or refuge. Mason flipped to the hymn indices and noted page numbers 2, 4, 5, etc. He compared them against the coordinates on an old nautical chart pinned to the library wall. Each pair of numbers formed a grid point. The result spelled a rough shape along the coast. A series of warehouses and storage docks abandoned decades ago, Red Valley's old port facilities. Cap, he murmured, you coded the map in hymns. Mrs. Renner approached quietly. Find what you needed? Maybe, he said. You have archives on the Juniper Basin Trust? She hesitated. That company? Thought they went bankrupt in the 80s. Maybe they did. I just need a trace. She returned 10 minutes later with a faded binder. Here, local filings, corporate deeds. He flipped pages until the name appeared, Juniper Basin Trust. Founded 1973, registered as a custodial financial entity for government-backed land investments. Exactly what Alcott's notes described. He photocopied the page and slid it into his coat. As they left, rain began again, tapping gently on the library's eaves. Across the street, the town's small chapel bell rang the noon hour. Echo looked up at the sound. Yeah, Mason said softly. Guess the hymns still play. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The wind's howl sounded too much like rotors. He saw the desert again, the convoy broken by an explosion, the dust rising like a curtain. His radio had crackled with conflicting signals. Possible civilian heat signature. His gut said move. The protocol said wait. He waited. By the time he confirmed, it was too late. The corporal who trusted his instincts lay still beside the burned truck. The medevac arrived to nothing left to save. In the years since, he'd replayed that minute more times than he could count. The pause, the doubt, the silence that followed. Now, in the lighthouse, another silence waited this one behind stone. He sat up, sweat cold on his neck, and whispered into the dark. Not again. Echo lifted her head, watching him without judgment. He reached down, fingers resting on her collar. We don't wait this time. 2 days later, Parrish called. Mr. Hale, she said smoothly, I hope the storm didn't cause too much trouble. Your man trespassed during it. She paused. That's a serious accusation. I've got his badge. Her voice cooled. Bring it to my office. Let's discuss this like adults. He didn't trust her, but he went. The meeting was set at a seaside cafe, a place with linen napkins and cappuccino foam instead of coffee rings. Parrish waited at a corner table, perfect as ever. You look tired, she said. Your people keep me busy. She gestured to the seat opposite. Please. Mason sat but didn't touch the drink she'd ordered for him. She slid a folder across. Legal drafts. Nothing binding yet. Think of this as guidance. He glanced at the top sheet. Petition to condemn structure as hazardous. Routine, she said. If you sign transfer before hearing, we can avoid publicity. You always this generous to squatters? You're not a squatter, she said. You're an obstacle. That earned a small smile from him. Honest, at least. Parrish stirred her tea, voice softening again. You served, didn't you? Afghanistan? He didn't answer. My brother did too, she went on. Didn't come back right. Isolation eats people, Mason. Maybe it's time you let someone else carry the burden. He studied her face. You rehearsed that line? Doesn't make it less true. He leaned forward. Tell me about the ribbon cutting. 1998. Red Valley headquarters. Your father was there. Her spoon stopped mid-stir. How do you... He tapped his jacket pocket where the photocopy of the corporate filing rested. Your nonprofit didn't exist until 2003. But I've got a photo proving the name Harbor Renewal Trust was on banners 5 years earlier. So which is it, a family heirloom? Her eyes flickered, just once. Then the mask returned. Be careful, Mr. Hale. Some histories aren't yours to excavate. She stood, left cash on the table, and walked out into the drizzle. Echo growled low under the table. Mason watched her disappear into the mist. We're getting close, girl. That night, the fog returned thicker than before, dense, wet, heavy enough to muffle the waves. Mason climbed to the lantern room to check the circuits. The repeater panel still pulsed faintly green. He connected Alcott's cipher disk, aligning the numbers with the sequence from the ledger. Echo paced nervously, tail twitching. When he keyed the sequence into the repeater, the foghorn groaned once, then again, then emitted 3 short, 1 long. The same Morse code as the buoy. You're an obstacle. That earned a small smile from him. Honest, at least. Parrish stirred her tea, voice softening again. You served, didn't you? Afghanistan? He didn't answer. My brother did too, she went on. Didn't come back right. Isolation eats people, Mason. Maybe it's time you let someone else carry the burden. He studied her face. You rehearsed that line? Doesn't make it less true. He leaned forward. Tell me about the ribbon cutting. 1998. Red Valley headquarters. Your father was there. Her spoon stopped mid-stir. How do you... He tapped his jacket pocket where the photocopy of the corporate filing rested. Your nonprofit didn't exist until 2003. But I've got a photo proving the name Harbor Renewal Trust was on banners 5 years earlier. So which is it, a family heirloom? Her eyes flickered, just once. Then the mask returned. Be careful, Mr. Hale. Some histories aren't yours to excavate. You're an obstacle. That earned a small smile from him. Honest, at least. Parrish stirred her tea, voice softening again. You served, didn't you? Afghanistan? He didn't answer. My brother did too, she went on. Didn't come back right. Isolation eats people, Mason. Maybe it's time you let someone else carry the burden. He studied her face. You rehearsed that line? Doesn't make it less true. He leaned forward. Tell me about the ribbon cutting. 1998. Red Valley headquarters. He turned the dial, listening. The pattern changed, spelling out coordinates. He recognized them. The grid points from the hymnal map. The repeater wasn't just a relic, it was transmitting to the offshore buoy, relaying signals to a barge positioned exactly where the old Red Valley storage docks had once stood. Alcott's hidden system was alive, and someone was using it now to move data or money. Cap, what did you wire me into? He whispered. Echo barked, startled by the horn's volume. If this is real, the money never belonged to Red Valley. She nodded slowly. Then we have a window. 48 hours to find the court order that created that trust. If the judge grants demolition authority before we prove the trust connection, you lose the property and the evidence. So we prove it. With what? A notebook and a tape? He hesitated, then opened the bulkhead and showed her the safe, the documents, the cassette. Claire's expression softened. John Alcott never stopped fighting ghosts, did he? Mason handed her the photocopy from the library. Juniper Basin Trust. Government custodian. He swept the beam across the floor and froze. 2 red canisters sat near the cabinet, their wicks looped to a timer wired to the electrical box. A timed incendiary. Claire! He shouted. She appeared behind him, eyes wide. Get back! He knelt, examining the device. It was crude, but effective detonators set to spark within minutes. Can you disarm it? She asked. Maybe. Echo whined, pawing at the floor. Mason pulled the wires, one by one, matching colors. Ignorant, a spark popped. He yanked the fuse free and flung it into a bucket of seawater by the door. Silence followed, heavy and total except for their breathing. Claire exhaled shakily. You just saved us both an awkward headline. He looked at Echo. She saved us. Again. They examined the doorframe. A faint smear of boot oil gleamed on the stone. Whoever had planted the device had come recently, maybe while they slept. Mason pulled the small security camera from the wall one of the unit's parish's crew had left during inspection. "We use their eyes against them," he said. "If this recorded, we've got proof." By dawn, fatigue hit like gravity. Claire slept again, but Mason couldn't. He took Echo down to the rocks where tide pools shimmered in morning light. He watched the horizon and spoke quietly. "You ever get tired of losing, Cap? Feels like I've been fighting shadows since the desert." The sea offered no answer but its rhythm. He crouched, running a hand through wet sand. "I waited once, cost a man his life. I swore I'd never hesitate again. But every move I make here feels like walking into the same mistake." Echo pressed her head against his knee, warm and solid. "Yeah," he whispered. "Maybe trusting instinct isn't the mistake. Maybe ignoring it is." He looked toward the lighthouse, its silhouette rising dark against the brightening sky. "We're finishing this," he said. Echo barked once, sharp, like punctuation. The storm returned that night, wind screaming over the cliffs. Claire had filed an emergency motion, buying them another day. Mason decided to use it. He climbed to the lantern room, rerouted the repeater through Alcott's Morse key, and programmed a short broadcast, one sentence. "Audit complete. Transfer confirmed." The bait was simple. Pretend the data exfiltration was finished, forcing whoever controlled the offshore barge to reveal themselves. He hit transmit. The horn groaned 3 times. Minutes later, radar pinged a vessel moving toward shore. "Hooked them," he murmured. He radioed the harbor master anonymously. "Unauthorized barge inside restricted zone. Possible salvage theft." Down below, Echo barked furiously. Through the window, headlights appeared on the cliff road, 2 SUVs crawling toward the lighthouse. "Company inbound," he said into the radio. Static, no reply. The power flickered. He looked at Echo. "We hold until the warrant hits." Thunder cracked, shaking the glass. The battle for North Point had officially begun. The wind rose until it felt like the ocean itself was trying to climb the cliffs. Every window trembled in its frame. Every seam of the lighthouse hissed with driven rain. Mason tightened the locks, checked the shutters, and watched water bead on the inside of the glass, a bad sign. The storm was no longer outside. It was inside the walls, creeping through cracks like an uninvited mace. Echo prow. Storm's J. But he moved through the tower in darkness, listening. The lighthouse had a way of carrying sound differently during storms. Footsteps multiplied. Voices bent in echoes that belonged to no one. Twice he thought he heard the faint clang of metal from the stairwell, only for it to... At the desk, Claire's briefcase sat open, papers weighted by a wrench. Among them lay the certified copy of the trust document, its court seals smudged from salt air. Mason looked at it and felt the weight of 2 wars pressing on the... Echo's bark cut through the storm. He turned. She stood at the door, muscles taut, facing the lower steps. The faint light from his lantern touched something new, water seeping under the threshold, mixed with the black shimmer of spilled oil. Mason's heart lurched. The intruders hadn't dealt. He grabbed the tape of Alcott's voice, shoved it and the notebook into his pack, and swung the bulkhead door shut behind him. Lightning flashed again, showing movement outside the narrow window, 2 silhouettes in hoods, one carrying a crowbar, the other a canister glinting. Echo lunged, barking with raw fury, the sound filling every corner of the tower. "Hold," Mason ordered, voice low but calm. He scanned the room, spotted the old flare gun mounted beside the stair. 1 round left. He grabbed it, flipped the safety. The 3rd hit cracked the door open, cold rain blasting inside. Mason fired. The flare hissed through the gap and exploded against the rocks outside, bathing the cliff in sudden red light. For an instant, the shapes of the intruders froze in that bloody glow, one stumbling back, the other shielding his face. Then they fled, vanishing into the storm. Mason stood in the doorway, chest heaving, the flare's afterimage burning behind his eyes. Echo pressed against his leg, panting, tail rigid. He looked out at the sea, where the faint outline of the barge still moved, stubborn against the waves. "They won't stop," he said. "Not till they get what's in that safe." The dog gave a quiet rumble, as if agreeing. He shut the door, dropped the bar across it, and leaned his forehead against the cool steel. "Then we won't stop either," he whispered. "Not this time." Outside, thunder rolled like a closing verdict, and the lighthouse bruised, leaking, still standing, braced for the final assault. By dawn, the storm had swallowed the horizon completely. The ocean was no longer water, but motion, a gray, breathing thing that clawed at the rocks below. The tower shook, as if remembering every strike of lightning it had ever endured. Mason hadn't slept. He'd fortified the lower doors with iron rods and fuel drums, nailed the broken planks across the hatch, and sealed every crack that let in wind. Claire stayed upstairs, radioing her courthouse contact every hour for confirmation of the emergency injunction. The call still hadn't come. Echo refused to rest. She paced the spiral stairs like a sentry, head snapping toward every creak of metal. Outside, engines idled in the fog. 2, maybe 3 vehicles. He could smell the exhaust mixing with salt and oil. "Parrish isn't waiting for a verdict," he muttered. A voice boomed through a loudhailer outside. "Mason Hale, open the door. This site is condemned under county order." Claire shouted down from the stairwell. "They don't have that authority." "They don't need it," Mason said grimly. "Not if the storm finishes the job." The loudhailer again. "Final warning," Echo growled, pressing against Mason's leg. He raised his voice over the wind. "If you want the trust, come earn it." The answer came not in words, but in action. A thud against the steel door, followed by the hiss of cutting torches. Mason looked to the bulkhead. "They're burning their way in." Claire ran down a few steps. "Then we move the evidence now." He grabbed the safe, the ledger, and the cassette, shoving them into the waterproof pack. Basement tunnel. Cap left the old flood channel open. It leads to the tide cave. She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll slow them down." Echo barked once sharp, protesting. He crouched beside Hare. "Guard Claire. Go." She didn't move. "Echo, stay with her. That's an order." The dog's ears flattened. But when Claire tugged the leash and whispered, "Come on, girl," she obeyed, reluctantly disappearing down the stairs. The first circle of the torch burned through the steel. The door glowed orange, then red. Mason slung his rifle, a rusted flare launcher, and waited by the stairwell. The moment the torchline reached halfway, he fired another flare through the opening. It burst outside in a brilliant arc, illuminating the cliffside and the intruders below. For an instant, he saw them clearly, 4 men in rain gear, one holding the torch, another shouldering a crowbar. Behind them, Parrish stood near the SUV, her coat whipping in the wind, face half lit by the burning red light. She didn't flinch. She simply pointed toward the door. Then the flare fizzled, leaving darkness thicker than before. Claire's flashlight jittered as she descended into the old flood tunnel. Water surged around her boots, icy and quick. Echo waited ahead, nose to the current, tail level. The tunnel slanted downward until it widened into a limestone cavern that opened onto the sea. Claire found the old dinghy Alcott had kept there half-submerged but serviceable. She shoved it toward the waterline, strapped the pack to the bow, and looked up the tunnel toward the lighthouse. "Mason!" she shouted. "We're ready." "Oh?" Her voice vanished into thunder. Echo barked twice, urgent. Above, through cracks in the stone, came muffled bangs, gunfire, or debris. She couldn't tell. She set her jaw. "He'll find us," she whispered, though her eyes said otherwise. Upstairs, sparks fell like rain. Mason ducked as the torch broke through. A boot kicked the door inward, followed by a flood of men shouting over the storm. He backed up the stairs, retreating toward the lens chamber. The intruders fanned out. "Search everything," one yelled. "He's got the files." A flashlight beam swept across the wall, catching the glint of the bulkhead latch. The man grabbed for it, but Mason struck first, swinging the wrench into his wrist. The flashlight clattered down the stairs. The man cursed, stumbling back into his partner. Another raised a pistol. Mason dove behind the engine console. A shot cracked, shattering glass. Wind howled through the new hole. "Where's Parrish?" Mason yelled. A voice answered from below, smooth as ever. "Here." She stepped into view at the base of the stairs, coat soaked but posture calm. "You've caused quite a scene, Mr. Hale. The county won't forgive this." This isn't about the county," he said. "It's about what your father hid." She smiled faintly. "You really think that ledger changes anything?" "I think sunlight changes everything." He grabbed the emergency lever and yanked it. A klaxon screamed as the backup beacon ignited a beam bright enough to pierce miles of fog. Its pulse struck the storm like lightning made constant. Somewhere out there, the harbor cameras would capture it. Parrish's composure cracked. "Turn that off." He stood in the glow. "Come and do it." Her men surged up the stairs. Mason hurled the wrench at the nearest, catching him in the shoulder. The second grabbed his arm. They grappled, crashing into the lens housing. Glass shattered, raining down like sharp snow. Mason shoved the man away, too late to notice the gasoline can tipped by his boot. Liquid spread across the floor. "Back!" he shouted, but one of the men fired. The muzzle flash touched the fumes. Fire roared up the stairwell. Mason dove behind the railing as the upper chamber erupted in light. Heat seared his face. The intruders screamed, retreating down the stairs. Parrish shouted, orders lost to the wind, but the fire was faster. He staggered toward the hatch, coughing through smoke. Through the haze, he saw the old signal repeater glowing bright green, still transmitting. "Cap," he rasped. "You wanted light. You got it." He pulled the main power cable, sending a final surge through the system. The beacon flared one last time, a blinding burst that tore through the storm clouds, a signal so bright it would register on every radar in the bay. Then the generator exploded. Salt water slapped his face. Mason coughed, half-conscious. He was lying on wet stone, rain pelting his skin. The lighthouse above him was aflame, a column of fire and smoke rising into the dawn. "Mason!" Claire's voice echoed from the surf. He turned. The dinghy bobbed nearby, Echo leaning over the side, barking madly. Claire waded toward him, eyes wide. "You're alive, thank God." "Mostly," he croaked. "You get the pack?" "Safe and dry." She nodded to the boat. "We need distance before the tower falls." He hauled himself aboard with her help. Echo licked his hand once, whined, then turned to face the burning cliff. The beacon collapsed inward with a low thunder. Debris rained into the waves. From offshore came another sound, sirens, dozens of them. Patrol boats sliced through the fog, lights flashing red and blue. Claire exhaled shakily. "Your flare signal worked. Coast Guard picked it up on radar. Whole harbor's watching." Mason looked back at the ruins. "Then it's done." But Echo barked once more, gaze fixed on the rocks. Between waves, a figure staggered from the rubble, Parrish, drenched, limping, still alive. She saw them, her face a pale mask in the firelight, and shouted over the wind, "You think the law will save you? That money was never yours." Mason met her eyes. It was never about money. Another wave crashed between them. When it cleared, she was gone, swept into the sea, or lost in smoke. He didn't know. He just sat back, trembling, as the boats drew near. Weeks later, in a Santa Fe courtroom, the truth surfaced through testimony and burnt fragments of evidence retrieved from the wreckage. The repeater's final transmission had been recorded by maritime monitors. The flare signal corroborated the timeline. Forensic accountants traced the Juniper Basin Trust funds back to dormant federal bonds, proving the assets were never part of Harbor Renewal's holdings. When the judge read the ruling, Mason felt none of the triumph the reporters craved, only quiet relief. "The court finds," the judge said, "that the custodian authority established under the 1973 Juniper Basin Trust remains valid and passes by succession to Mason Hale as lawful trustee." Outside, cameras flashed. Questions flew. Claire handled them all with her steady lawyer's poise. Mason stood aside, hand resting on Echo's collar, watching sunlight strike the courthouse dome. Claire joined him afterward. "You know, you could sell the rights, rebuild, do something with all that money." He shook his head. "It was never mine to spend. Alcott didn't keep it for wealth. He kept it to remind people what gets buried when greed writes the laws." She smiled. "And what will you do?" "Same as before," he said. "Keep the light on." Months later, Mason returned to North Point. The tower's ruins had been cleared, leaving only the foundation and the sea whispering through the stones. The state planned to rebuild the light as a heritage site. He'd volunteered to oversee it unpaid. Echo bounded across the new scaffolding, tail wagging, nose to the wind. The air smelled clean, renewed. Mason knelt, running his hand over the concrete base. "Still watching, Cap?" he murmured. "We did what you asked." "Aye." He opened the pack and placed the brass coin on the cornerstone, the old Juniper Basin crest. It gleamed once, catching the morning sunday. A seagull screamed overhead. Echo barked back, delighted. Mason smiled. "Guess that's a yes." The new lens assembly turned slowly, its light sweeping the gray water. Somewhere far off, a ship's horn answered three short, one long, the same code Alcott had left behind. Mason laughed under his breath. Message received. And he and Echo stood together on the cliff until the wind shifted and the first warmth of dawn touched the waves. For the first time in years, the light was no longer a burden. It was a promise. And for the first time in years, Mason Hale felt at home. The sea had calmed by the time autumn found North Point again. The lighthouse rose anew, not as a fortress this time, but as a memorial. Fresh paint gleamed where fire had once eaten through iron. The new lens turned with a clean hum, sweeping light across the water like a heartbeat restored. Mason Hale watched from the observation deck, mug of coffee steaming in his hands. The salt wind carried a smell he'd come to love: wet rope, diesel, kelp, and rain. All the scents of a life that had nearly broken him, now folded into something gentler. Echo lay beside him, muzzle streaked with gray, eyes half closed in the Sunday. She still lifted her head at the faintest sound, a gull cry, the thump of a distant boat, the world reminding her it was still turning. Below them, workers packed up scaffolding and tools. The state had finished its reconstruction weeks early. Reporters had already come and gone, hungry for another headline about the veteran who guarded the light. But Mason had nothing left to say to cameras. He'd learned that silence sometimes told the truest story. Claire visited once more before leaving for Santa Fe. She brought official letters, legal seals, words that confirmed what he already knew: the funds were safe, the trust reestablished, the court case closed. "You could still sell the rights," she said lightly, handing him the envelope. "Buy land inland. Live easy." He smiled faintly. "You think I'd fit inland?" She laughed. "No, you'd start rebuilding the nearest riverbank just to make it look like the coast." They shared a quiet pause, the kind that only comes between people who've stood through the same fire. "Mason," she said softly, "you ever regret staying here?" He looked out at the horizon where the light cut through haze and cloud, tracing a golden path across the surface. "No," he said. "If I left, I'd spend the rest of my life listening for the sea anyway." She nodded, understanding. "Then keep the light steady." When she drove away, her taillights vanished behind the curve of the hill. Mason stood alone again, but this time, alone didn't mean abandoned. That night, he wrote a final entry in Alcott's old ledger. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and salt, their edges curled by years. "To whoever reads this next, the light belongs to no one man. It belongs to those who need to find their way home. Keep it honest. Keep it burning." He closed the book, placed it on the rebuilt shelf beside the new lens housing, and left the pen resting across it like a bookmark between two lives. Echo stretched, padding toward him, nails clicking softly against the polished floor. He crouched, running his hand along her neck. "We did all right, didn't we?" She leaned into him, pressing her weight against his leg, her quiet answer. Outside, dusk deepened into violet. The wind smelled of distant rain, though the sea was still. The beam rotated once, then twice, carving a white arc through the gathering dark. Mason leaned against the railing, eyes half closed. The rhythm of the waves matched the slow rise and fall of Echo's breathing. For the first time, the silence around him felt complete, not empty, not waiting for ghosts or danger, just complete. He realized then that the lighthouse had never been about guarding wealth, or proving innocence, or even redeeming the past. It was about endurance, the kind that keeps burning long after storms pass and crowds forget. He reached down, scratched behind Echo's ear, and whispered, "Let's keep watch a little longer, partner." The horizon shimmered, faint and endless. The light turned again, sweeping across the water, touching everything, even the parts no one could see. And when it passed over Mason and the dog at his side, it left them wrapped in gold, two silhouettes standing against the vast calm sea, keepers of the light, finally at peace.